Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Department of Justice Elder Justice Initiative webinar, Law Enforcement Investigations of Financial Exploitation and Fraud of Older Americans. Due to the high number of participants, computer audio will only be the option to listen to the presentation, so please make sure your computer speakers are on. If you do need to adjust the volume on your computer speakers, please click on the little computer icon at the top of your screen. It's a little speaker. This webinar will be recorded and available on the Department of Justice Elder Justice Initiative website after this training. Closed captioning is provided in the pod below the presentation. If you're having issues viewing closed captioning and do not have an Adobe Connect app installed on your computer, please close out of this meeting, download the Adobe Connect application, and then rejoin the webinar. If you don't wish to download the app, you can close out of the webinar, make sure Adobe Flash is enabled on the web browser that you're using, and then rejoin the meeting that way. Then click on the link and join with the classic view, and you can see the screenshot there below. If you have any technical issues during the webinar, you can communicate with me in the chat pod. So right now we have 4 polls that we would love for all of you to take. And once we're all done taking them, I will move them back onto out of the screen. In case you haven't gotten a chance to take them yet, please go ahead and do so now. I'll display the results before I turn this over to Andy Mao from the Elder Justice Initiative. So we'll just take a minute or so to make sure everybody can take the poll. Maybe another 20 seconds. All right, I'm going to broadcast the results. Okay, and now I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Andy Mao.
Good afternoon and good morning, everyone, depending upon where you're dialing in from. I'm Andy Mao. I'm the coordinator of the Department's Elder Justice Initiative, and want to thank everyone for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today for this webinar focusing on investigating elder financial exploitation. The Elder Justice Initiative within the Department of Justice has 2 broad responsibilities. One is the initiative helps to organize and coordinate the department's nursing home efforts, investigating nursing homes that are providing grossly substandard care to Medicare and Medicaid beneficiaries. However, the second responsibility of the initiative and what we're focusing on today is to support the efforts of state and local law enforcement, prosecutors, and the large array of elder justice professionals in their efforts to combat elder abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation. Obviously, our state and local partners are the front line for the vast majority of elder abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation that impacts older adults across the country. And so it is our primary responsibility to make sure that you and your colleagues are armed with as much training, resources, and information as possible. The slide on the slide deck right now highlights some of the different types of materials and resources that we have developed, and all of the content that we develop at the Elder Justice Initiative is all available on our website, elderjustice.gov, and it is largely a reaction to requests or information that we receive from the field, from professionals like yourselves. We try hard to develop content and materials and resources that we think will be helpful to people to do their jobs better. And so at the conclusion of this, and I would invite you at any time to the extent that you think that there's something that can help you all do your jobs better, we want to hear about it. And we're happy to consider whether or not there's something that we can do to help develop that content or those resources. However, today is I'm very, very excited about today's program, where we're going to be able to talk to 3 extremely experienced law enforcement officers and talk about how to investigate financial exploitation. It is a growing issue. Billions of dollars are lost each year. And it seems to us at the initiative that the lack of training and lack of resources should not be the barrier to pursuing those cases. And so we think it's critical that we continually share best practices and the knowledge of those who have been doing these cases. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce the panelists for today's discussion. Next slide, please. Moderating today's panel will be Chief of Police Gary McNamara with the Fairfield Police Department. He's retired, but with a tremendous amount of experience, and he'll be moderating our panel, including Skip Swain, a detective with the Fresno County Sheriff's Office Elder Abuse Unit, as well as Charles Chakowski, a detective with the Colorado Springs Police Department. Unfortunately, Investigator Higgins has a trial, and so won't be able to join us today, but we'll sort of muddle our way through. So with that, it's my pleasure to hand the baton over to Chief McNamara to lead our discussion on investigating these cases. Chief?
Sure, Andy, thank you very much. And what a timely discussion that we are having, given the fact that we know there is always exploitation of the elderly. However, given the experiences with COVID and with the isolation and fear that has gripped many of our seniors, we know that this is a time when it's most important that we continue to fight and collaborate on these efforts. We know it's there. We know that these kind of cases require a lot of work. And we also know that many departments have a variety of different ways in which they investigate them. And we noticed by the poll, first of all, thank you all very much for participating in the poll. As you will see, it's a variety of different entities combining together to hear this presentation, and at the same time, different levels of experience. But one of the significant ways we find that collaborations really work are in the area of MDTs, and I know many have seen MDTs very successful in child abuse cases, domestic violence cases, but certainly in the area of elder abuse, can be a significant game changer in areas and regions coming together to collaborate and investigate these cases. Those MDTs require strong leadership and dedication amongst the members and cooperation amongst a variety of different organizations coming together. We have 2 individuals today who are deeply involved in MDTs in their agencies, and I think it is truly important that they share with us, all of us, their experiences, what works, and then their unique perspective on some of the things you may or may not have ever thought about when you're investigating these cases. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Detective Chuck Zetkowski from the Colorado Springs Police Department. And Chuck, maybe you could just give an overview of your MDT program, the situation you're facing, and then I'll follow it up with a series of questions that may be helpful for all of us.
Thank you, Chief. Colorado was slow to come on board with mandated reporting for what we call at-risk adults. If you're 70 years old or older or have a disability, you're at risk. And we didn't start it until 2014. I've actually been working the cases since 2005. We work real closely with Adult Protective Services here. The civilian investigator in our unit is half funded by the police department, half funded by the Adult Protective Services. She's a retired homicide detective who's been to the Adult Protective Services Caseworker Academy. And that really facilitates the sharing of information while we're doing our joint investigations.
So, you mentioned funding. Obviously, we can all appreciate the fact that funding becomes a real issue when it comes to setting up some of these programs. A lot of it comes down to the value that people see in the work that we do, but clearly funding is always in the minds of a lot of different people. But let me just ask you one question. What is your opinion on the economic and social cost of exploitation of elders? Because that's a significant question when we start talking about requesting funds to investigate. What is the impact we're really talking about?
Well, it's really significant, Chief. MetLife Mature Market Institute did 2 studies in 2009 and 2011. These were very simple studies. What they did was go through newspaper articles to see reports of exploitation. And we know, as we all know, these cases are very underreported. But in 2009, they found that in 2008, $2.6 billion was reported stolen, and that went up to $2.9 billion in 2011. I mean, we can think about all the social and economic impacts, but almost 1 in 10 of those victims will end up on Medicaid as a direct result from this exploitation. And you can see how that impacts state budgets and federal budgets.
And all of us have to keep those numbers in mind. I remember as police chief, one of the things that you always need when you ask for funding is why you need the funding. And certainly those numbers are a very good reason to ask for those funding. But, unique, and we put it up there as a poll question. So, Chuck, just a question for you. And a lot of people said they knew about it and others didn't. But as we start to look at really investigating, what are the unique things that we need to understand to investigate that? And you talk about undue influence. And how do we really define undue influence?
Well, I'm sure that every state has its own definition. I mean, that's part of the problems that we have when we try to study mistreatment and exploitation across the country, is we all have different standards. So the American Bar Association defines undue influence as means the excessive persuasion that causes another person to act or refrain from acting by overcoming that person's free will and resulting in inequity. Here in Colorado, it means take advantage of an at-risk person's vulnerable state of mind, neediness, pain, or emotional distress.
So it's easy to have a definition. We know that. And but at the same time, one of the things when we start to investigate and conduct those investigations, how do we investigate? How does the investigation of undue influence cases differ from let's just say, a regular theft case? And when we start talking about larcenies, there's a way in which we all investigate them. But how does undue influence really change that?
And that's a good point, Chief, because those of us in law enforcement and prosecution are generally accustomed to dealing with an event, a theft, a robbery, an assault. And we don't understand that undue influence is not an event, it's a process. And then it's complicated, much like in domestic violence cases, in that our victims will continue to stay with the perpetrators. It may appear consensual or civil initially when we look at it. And so it really complicates our investigation of these cases.
And our goal here is to discuss some specifics, but also really learn about the power of MDTs. And when we start talking about and discussing undue influence and the unique talents you need to prove those cases, and that it's events, that it's a long-term grooming, many times our patrol officers, with all the other responsibilities they have, are not necessarily able to really invest the time probably to devote to do that. So I'll ask you this, though. How do we establish that? How do we establish the undue influences? We know that they differ and there's a significant role it plays, but how would we establish that in trying to prosecute these cases?
There are several different things that we need to look at and document in our report. We talk about the vulnerability of the victim, which is commonly referred to as capacity issues, and Skip's going to address capacity more in depth here. But, is it a temporary impairment resulting in some sort of injury or illness or decline? So it's important to find out what's going on in their life. And with older Americans, medications can induce states that alter a person's ability to make judgment. And they may have a debilitating grief reaction. They recently lose a long-term spouse or a loved one, and this caused some sort of diminished capacity. And the big thing that we see is isolation. Many times our perpetrators will isolate our victims not only from the community but from access to their finances, and so that they don't know what's going on. So when we want to look at the influencer's apparent authority and the power differential that exists between our perpetrator and the victim, and then look at the inequity of the results. Who gained from the actions of the perpetrator?
And let me ask you a question with that. So do you train your patrol officers to look for that when they're doing investigations, to put in their reports any of those indicators from undue influence that may later on go to prove your case?
We have a 3-hour block that we teach at our basic police academy, and then we do every couple of years we do refresher training during in-service training on it. And we'll have a unit like mine that's specialized in it, and we often go out and attend roll calls and do roll call video training just to remind officers.
Because I would imagine that if we're not sharing that with our frontline officers, then we're certainly not getting some information that they probably are not even aware that they should be gathering during their investigations. They oftentimes confront people in some basic encounters that may not, on its face value, lead to them determining that there may be some further abuse. So that obviously is very helpful. And we're going to get back to some of that, but you mentioned Chuck, you mentioned that Skip was going to kind of take an approach to some of the other issues, especially on capacity and evidence collection. So it is my great pleasure to next introduce Detective Skip Swain from the Fresno County Sheriff's Department. And Skip, if you could just kind of go over your MDT as it sits, and then maybe I'll follow up with some questions on evidence and capacity of doing these investigations to complement what Chuck just shared.
Skip, we can't hear you.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Chief. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Here in Fresno, we've been lucky since 1999 to be co-located with Adult Protective Services in a senior resource center, and the Ombudsman is on campus also. So getting together for an MDT is not as difficult as other areas, and I see that other areas and other investigators don't even participate in the MDTs. So, when they talk about it taking a village to raise a child, it really does take the whole village to protect an elder or a dependent adult, someone who can't protect themselves. So our MDT is pretty organized here, and participated with the Public Guardian's Office, with the Ombudsman, with Adult Protective Services, and we also have some of the local hospital discharge planners that attend. So we meet once a month, and it's usually for a good couple hours, and there's about 30 to 40 representatives in the room from other agencies that can really delve in, and each one of us is specialized in an area, and we can make a difference for those folks.
And actually both of your models are really success stories, and you've had some really successful cases that you've prosecuted as a result of the MDT approach that I'm sure you probably would not have been able to, or certainly would have taken a lot longer if you did not have that MDT approach. I mean, obviously co-locating is a benefit, but even if you can't, because some agencies can't, large, smaller ones may not be able to do that, but clearly if you can, it's important to kind of have those regular meetings. And, if you saw the results of the survey, you realize that there's a sampling of participants on this call today. All of them play a significant role in setting up an MDT. So hopefully they are from different areas, but at the same time, there may be partners on the phone that at some point would consider that. But let me ask you a question about evidence and collection and capacity. So what type of evidence, when you start talking about these investigations, is really important that we start collecting from the victim?
Well, nothing is simple, but first of all, we want to if it's a financial case, we want to go after bank records. We want to find out where they bank and how the suspect has gained access to those funds, whether through a power of attorney, whether it be through a trust that he or she are acting upon prematurely. Those, are good starts for us as to how did we get into the money. Is it undue influence? There's components for undue influence for us. I think every state kind of has a whole different deal. We deal with 65 and older in California, but once we've determined how they got into the bank account or how they were able to move properties, we, through here in California, we use a government code section to gain bank records for our elders, our victims, without a search warrant. They shall provide those records to us, and they do. But also, we deal with real estate transactions and things like that, so it's not uncommon for us to write a search warrant for an escrow file. But on the lower end of things, we want home video. We want to talk to neighbors. We want neighbor statements. We want video at the bank, ATM video. Who's going to the ATM? Is Mrs. or Mr. with them, or are they by themselves, or we just had a case here in Fresno with a $5 million loss where the suspect was taking Mr. into check cashing spots and cashing stock checks, and one of them over $800,000. And the video in that case is very telling. So talk to those neighbors. Don't just talk to family and friends, because often family and friends, they haven't seen a decline, or your neighbors may have heard or seen something too. We also really like the digital data records from the computers, because our elders do not have the PayPal accounts normally. They don't have the Amazon. They're not ordering the Amazon. So when we can show all of this going to one house, then we can kind of figure out where that went. Also, tax records. Tax records are important on both sides because, you get a suspect's bank records and you look and see how much money has been going in compared to how much he's claimed on his taxes, and there's obviously a big discrepancy. Those are helpful. And the other thing, last that I'll point out, is the credit bureau reports are very helpful, because there's so much identity theft that goes along with the financial exploitation. And we're just talking, we're not even talking about the scam cases right now. We're just talking about family and friends being the suspects, the trusted ones. I haven't even touched on outside the scams.
Yeah, there are a whole lot of other investigations when it comes to elder abuse that MDT, and for those of you, we kind of talk about it, we're just using the MDT, but the whole concept of MDT is multidisciplinary teams. In other words, gathering people who are experts in other disciplines, bringing them together for one purpose. Because if you get the team doing it, then the entire investigation becomes better, because they're all certainly engaged in it. So besides victim evidence and suspect evidence, are there medical records that would be important to that financial abuse investigation?
Absolutely. It shows the decline often, and I actually, as an investigator, use the slums myself. I have encouraged other agencies and APS to do some sort of a cognitive assessment or use a cognitive assessment tool. You do not have to be certified or a doctor to use these. It's very good. It came into play in one of our large cases this year. It was a $6 million loss, a $5 or $6 million loss, and the public health nurse went with our APS worker and determined through her slums that this gentleman likely is suffering from a diminished capacity, greatly diminished in this case. So medical records are imperative to show, especially if they've been seen by a neurologist, they've had that MRI, you can show that progression, and if they're being followed or treated, it's helpful.
And that cognitive test that you perform, so you don't need to be certified in it, so you just use that in your efforts to build probable cause.
It's an investigative tool, and you do not need to be certified. I find that the slums is pretty in-depth. Some of my victims become frustrated while doing it, but the BIMS, which is widely used with skilled nursing facilities throughout the country, is much simpler. It's on an 8-point scale. So, but it gives you an idea of where these people are at, because when we talk to them, everyone knows who the President of the United States is. Most everyone is oriented to right now. But it's when you start asking these questions and asking them to follow things outside the box is when you start seeing, oh, there might be a problem here.
So I'll throw this out to both of you. And so, you know, as I did the introductions, I mentioned that your MDT programs are up and running and have been for quite some time and have seen a lot of success with those programs. Are there other outreach that you do? I know you mentioned before some of the partners that you may reach out to, and some people are questioning how do you get the banks to cooperate more, but besides the banks, I'll throw it out with that first of all. How do you get the banks to cooperate more with either spotting it first and reporting it or helping with the investigation as a whole? Throw it out to both of you there.
Well, I'll take that first, Chuck. I've been investigating this for not as long as Chuck, but for 10 years, and I have made relationships with the fraud investigators at the banks. So it's very helpful, and also some of the larger credit corporations where you get that investigator that knows you and knows what you do and aren't worried about things, and they will freeze accounts with an email because of you have an open and active investigation. So those relationships, establishing those relationships, not just with them, but with others across the community, are so important in investigating these crimes.
And that's the same here, Skip. We have, good relationships, especially with the locally, state-owned credit unions and banks. We do regular training with the staff. They get to know us personally, and many of them, they've had the same clients for decades, and then when they see changes in activity, they automatically notify us. So we don't have the pleasure of the laws that California has, and for the larger organizations, we have to get court orders for production of records, and the problem is they have 60 days to respond to those, so it really delays our investigation.
So a couple of questions for you. How do most of your cases come to you? Let me start with you, Chuck. How do you find your cases started? How do they get to the attention of the MDT program and your unit to really start those investigations? Which is the most common way?
The most common way is family members that notice differences. Somebody new has come into the person's life, the gardener, the auto mechanic, the painter, or another family member has suddenly gotten charge of the finances. I sort of call it the custody battle of the 21st century. Whoever controls mom or dad controls the purse strings. And then our relationship with APS, it's really important because many times they go out on cases that don't appear to be criminal, but having worked with us, they start to understand the criminal law, and they disclose stuff in their investigations. It may turn out to appear to be a self-neglect case, but turn into an exploitation case.
And Skip, is that similar for you, that they generally come from family members?
Yeah, I would say most of the cases come from family members or friends, but we here in Fresno have a website that they can contact my lieutenant directly via email to make reports to, and they come down that way. But so we get them through our patrol division, we get them through APS. I can walk out of my office and have APS look up an address and see how many referrals, or a person and see how many referrals they've had on that person. And likewise, I can say, well, we've responded to this house just recently. You know, we have a demented lady who's in need of services. We don't think she's become a victim, but it came to my attention from a patrolman where we've been there 104 times in just over a year. And so it's like, okay, well, we need to get other people involved. And so, but yes, most of our cases come from family or friends.
Do you find it the courts are supporting these investigations and prosecuting? I guess the MDT program do they have a dedicated court, or do you have prosecutors that are dedicated to follow the case from start to finish?
I have a vertical prosecutor here in Fresno for all of the felonies, and he files the misdemeanors as well, and then he farms those out to the misdemeanor team. But we have a vertical prosecutor. He also takes part in our MDTs here.
We don't have that in Colorado yet, but we do have a new district attorney, and I am meeting with him on Thursday to discuss how we can better prosecute these cases.
Yeah, I would imagine that having that access and somebody in the courts that understood the uniqueness of those cases is a pretty powerful ally to have as you bring them forward. Then a final question from me would be, are there any laws? I know in the state of Connecticut and other states they have laws on sexual predators, where there's a predator list of people who are predators against children. Are there any such laws in your area, or is there any thought of that these become people that are known predators against the elderly? And maybe you don't experience it in that way. I'm just curious whether or not other parts of the country are looking at that as a possible model to track these individuals.
In California, we do not have a registry for elder abusers. However, it would be helpful, especially because we are seeing more of these room and boards acting as board and care. Should be licensed facilities where these folks need paramedical care. And we just shut one down last week where I think 5 of the 6 folks that were in there were veterans. And not only is this person running a room and board, but they are also purporting themselves to be licensed to the discharge planners. And then when the discharge planners are discharging from a difficult patient from the hospital, they're looking for that place, and they are using this person to shuffle folks out. And I think without knowledge that she's unlicensed, but that person becomes their IHSS care provider. They have no access to a telephone or computer, but they're signing their time cards, right? So we know, or we suspect that the suspect is doing that. She also is applying for other benefits, including food stamps and things like that for these folks. She's becoming their payee on their Social Security. You know, they are the forgotten or the family lists, or you know, other issues have gotten them in the situation they're in. And so a registration would be helpful for folks like this, because once she's prosecuted, and she will be, we would love to shut her down and keep her from doing this. She can't be licensed because she's got a couple prison priors, but you know, she's older now and she's making a lot of money on these folks.
Chuck, what about on your end? Do you have any sense of what it looks like out there?
In Colorado, we don't have a central registry, but we do have, through our Department of Human Services at the state level, if Adult Protective Services substantiates against a caretaker for neglect, exploitation, their name goes on that list, and all employers are required to check that list prior to hiring somebody.
Yeah, imagine your experiences and probably some of the experience of others on this conference. They are like child predators or other predators. That's what they do. So they find victims, and they will always continue to find victims, and I think that's one of the ways in which we can help that. So, Andy, I'll turn it back to you whether there are any other questions from the audience with regards to, Chuck and Skip.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chief. One question I had for the panelists was, and we hear this all the time, is who analyzes the financial records that you guys are able to pull together? Oftentimes, it's hard. Not everyone's trained. Like, who does it for you? Do you guys have your own sort of financial forensic unit, or is it you guys? Like, how do you do it? Who actually does this part of the work in terms of putting the story together with the financial records?
We do. We now have a crime analyst, but we do not have a forensic auditor. We do have a crime analyst. We don't have a forensic accountant. There are, on the civil side of things, oftentimes a forensic accountant that is hired, but we're talking big losses where a victim has the money to get themselves an attorney, to retain that counsel, and move forward with that, and are able to fund that portion of it. But other than that, I have a really good partner who's pretty frugal and very good at looking at financial documents.
We don't have forensic accountants either, but what we do have is they just recently purchased a program where we can scan the financial statements and stuff, and just print it out in a format that we can sort and stuff to look at to give us a better idea. And, when Skip talked about the evidence gathering, it's really important to gather those financial records that existed before the person came into the life and got control of the finances, so you can see the difference in the changing in the spending patterns.
Right. Another question I had was, and you guys described your relationships with your prosecutors, and I'm wondering, we've also heard there are some times when if they have a very, very good relationship with the prosecutor, the law enforcement, the detective can just go to them and say, this is a good one, here's the evidence, and get them to prosecute. Other times it's more challenging, especially where the victim may have capacity issues. And so I'm wondering, in your experience, what do prosecutors look for? And have you found situations where if the victim has, severe dementia or other sort of capacity issues, that they are more reluctant to take the case because they don't have a victim who's going to be able to speak up on their own behalf? And what do you do in those cases to make sure that those cases are brought?
Well, with my prosecutor, we do meet with him a lot prior to filing of a case to get him on board and kind of show him our hand before it just gets submitted to him. Also, we normally get a filing before we make an arrest, so not everyone is under the gun, providing that the victim is safe and we have that time for the investigation. But you do, I'll let you go, Chuck.
It's actually, we have more success with prosecuting the cases where we can show that they lack capacity. It's difficult to make prosecutors understand that somebody can have capacity and still be unduly influenced. So, if I can get the medical records to show that they were diagnosed with Alzheimer's, 2 or 3 years before they signed a power of attorney and all this stuff, then it's easier for us to get a prosecution out of them.
And Andy, I'll jump in there just to say that I think a key component in all of this is strong leadership. I think you need the leaders of the organization to make this a priority, engage and collaborate with the right people, make sure that they understand the reason behind it, and hopefully that leadership can make the prosecutors understand the really need to prosecute these cases because the numbers and the victims are so high.
Absolutely, I agree. And guys, I'm going to keep you on the hot seat just for a little bit longer. Chuck, you mentioned that you guys recently purchased a program that helps to scan financial records. One of our attendees wanted to know what that program was. Can you share that with the audience?
You know, I can't remember what the acronym stands for. I'd have to get with our SARS from the Financial Crimes Unit that helps me with these things. And we've just started playing with it, so, you know, we're learning how to use it too. But if I can get that name and email it to somebody after we're done here.
Sure. We'll try to keep track of that. But one other question I have for you, and this dovetails with both, you know, what we've been talking about, the difficulty of putting together these records in order to provide enough evidence to the prosecutor to take the case. I think it was Chuck, you mentioned that you guys have developed relationships with the state credit union and local banks. One of the questions that we got from the audience was, how do you develop that relationship? How do you get them to cooperate? Sometimes there isn't enough initially to issue, you know, a warrant or serve process. Like, how do you develop that relationship with them so that they'll come to you if they notice something going astray? And a second part of that question was, do they actually sometimes help with the financial analysis part? Do they actually help, you know, not just give you the records, but help you analyze the records to show whether or not something is going on? Either Chuck or Skip, or thoughts on that?
Let me back up just 1 minute. There is a program out there called ScanWriter. I'm not plugging them. I just I saw the vendor at the National Symposium, Elder Abuse Symposium, and that is a program where you can scan in bank records and receipts, and it will pick things out. And it's like a forensic accountant in a computer for us. I do not have that program. We're looking at a future purchase of that. But moving back to the question, Andy, the relationships with the fraud investigators are extremely important, and we have a pretty good run of luck getting financial records through search warrants. Our judges here, you know, we're not going into somebody's home, we're going into their bank account, and if we spell out the probable cause for it, usually if we're involved, there's something there, and we haven't had a whole lot of problem getting search warrants. We write several search warrants a month.
Okay, and Chuck?
They don't help us actually analyze and then do the investigation. They will give us, you know, talk about trends and what our victim did before this person got involved, you know, and when they saw the changes in the activity coming in. We're fortunate in that we're a relatively small community still, you know, 500,000 people. And I know a lot of these fraud investigators face-to-face because we spend time together. We get together for quarterly meetings. And so a lot of times those personal relationships really help smooth the way.
That makes total sense. One other question before we sort of shift gears a little bit, and that is, you guys talked about how you use Slum and MOCA and these other types of capacity assessment tests during the course of the investigation and possibly for purposes of developing probable cause for a search warrant. But once a case is going to trial and the prosecutor has to prove undue influence or some sort of decisional capacity issue, in your experience, how have the prosecutors done that? Do they then get a different expert? Do they also rely upon these tests? Like, how do they prove that in litigation? If you can share that with us.
Well, I really support the use of expert witnesses, because if you get a geropsychologist, they can do case-specific reviews and talk about undue influence in that case, or they can just talk about it from the general social psychological aspect of undue influence.
Great, thank you. Skip, anything to add on that one?
Well, we don't go to trial very often, but normally if I'm going to use some sort of a cognitive screening tool, it's because I have encountered a victim who's body is outliving their brain. They aren't seeing a doctor on a regular basis, maybe for a couple reasons. They don't like them, they don't need them, or the suspect doesn't want them to see the doctor. That has happened. So oftentimes with a case like that, we end up making a public guardians referral, which then they do have some sort of a capacity declaration, or I've asked for capacity declarations to be done by their doctor or by the hospital if we're transporting them, so that I can get that capacity declaration, and I think it stands pretty well. But I can't remember needing an expert witness for capacity itself.
Okay, great. Thank you. With that, I think we're going to shift gears a little bit and give our panelists a breather. As I mentioned before, one of the most important things that the department has been focusing on is to develop resources and training for law enforcement, prosecutors, and other elder justice professionals to help them in their efforts. And so what I wanted to do is shift gears a little bit and highlight some of the resources and information that the department has developed and that is available to everyone. And so first I want to hand the mic over to our colleague, Vonda, with the Community-Oriented Policing Services, or COPS office at the Department of Justice. Vonda Matthews is one of our dearest sort of partners, and will highlight some of the materials and information that COPS has put out. So with that, Vonda.
Thank you, Andy. And also thank you to the chief and the detectives for sharing your expertise, and clearly you're making a difference in the lives of the vulnerable adults in your community. I am with the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, or COPS office. We are the component within the Department of Justice responsible for advancing the practice of community policing by the nation's, state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement agencies. We provide training, technical assistance, knowledge products, as well as grant resources. We try to be the one-stop shop for agencies looking for resources as we try to identify and share promising practices, much like the ones presented by, Chief McNamara, Detective Swain, and Sorky. I cannot thank you enough for sharing your expertise, and this is what we try to do, is we try to gather this information and then share it out to community members. And then we do that through a couple ways. One is we do it through the called CRITAC, the Collaborative Reform Initiative for Technical Assistance Center, where we take in requests and we tailor technical assistance and training resources, which can include doing some of the forensics accounting that you've mentioned, Andy, and you try to hone in on it. So we can, if an agency, a small agency, really does need some resources that you don't have anything locally, you could go to our website, which is at cops.usdoj.gov /collaborative reform, and you can actually request those, and we can make those kind of assessment and then actually send it out or do it over the phone and try to provide some assistance. So we do have some resources that can actually help address a specific issue. Also on the COPS website, if you're there, we would encourage you to go visit. We obviously have hundreds of publications, but we also have what's called our podcast called The Beat, and we have 3 of those that include some of the people we just heard today. And we have one on collective evidence. That's actually by a different detective and a prosecutor. But we have one on role of law enforcement in recognizing and responding to elder abuse, which includes Chief McNamara, as well as Andrea Higgins, who is the DA, who was not able to join us today. And then we do have a podcast on the financial exploitation scams and correcting kind of misperceptions and collecting evidence by Detectives Swain and Swarovski. So thank you again. Would encourage you to visit our website. We also have community policing dispatch articles. So if there are other people out on the line that you want to share your good stories, we would love to capture them and put them out in our community policing dispatch. It's a free newsletter. Everyone can sign up for it, and we would love to tell your story. One last resource that I would mention is our COPS training portal, where we're growing a number of free, self-paced, interactive online training. And then there's a special resource section we've added, which just captures just all the elder justice resources, and we're trying to gather it across the Department of Justice and some of the external ones, which includes our dispatch articles, the podcast I mentioned, the publications, and what we started doing is highlighting even some of the stuff that Andy is going to talk about, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Andy. Thank you so much for including us.
Great. Thank you, Vonda. With that, I wanted to do a super fast tour of some of the resources on the Elder Justice website. I think I mentioned to you before, we've been working on the content on this website for over, the initial part of the website started over 10 years ago, and the idea was to create a one-stop shop for state and local prosecutors and law enforcement and elder justice professionals for resources and training and information that could be useful to them. And so what I'm going to do now is spend the next couple minutes just lightning fast going through highlighting some of those materials. The first one is EAGLE, the Elder Abuse Guide for Law Enforcement. This is an online resource that was developed through a partnership between us and the University of Southern California and the National Center on Elder Abuse. It is an online free resource for law enforcement that contains a wealth of materials, including checklists for what information to gather and evidence to gather, a first responder checklist that has a whole repository of statutes in every single state. All of the materials that we generate for law enforcement are housed, a lot of them are housed here and accessible in a really easy to use format. I would note a really added benefit recently was that IADLEST, who I suspect many of you know, the International Association of Directors of Law Enforcement and Standards, certified an online training that USC and NCA developed in conjunction with the National Center for White Collar Crime and Crime Center. And it is now certified. So in almost 35 states, by taking the training, you will receive credit to satisfy law enforcement's sort of annual training requirements. And we are doing everything we can to try to get the other remaining states to certify it as well, because we think people need to get trained. It's hard to get training into police academy, and this way you will get credit for it by taking this important online training on elder abuse. In addition to EAGLE, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Senior Abuse Financial Tracking and Accounting Tool, which is a mouthful to be sure, or SAFTA. This was our attempt in working with the International Association of Chiefs of Police to address the problem which we've all been talking about, which is the fact that sometimes we don't have an auditor or a financial analyst who can help a detective or an officer develop the evidence. And so our thought was, is there a way to create some sort of user-friendly tool, sort of like TurboTax for law enforcement, in order to identify what types of financial records should be gathered and to create a user-friendly interface that will help them enter the information into a spreadsheet so that they can then present the resulting evidence to prosecutors in order to try to persuade them to take on the case. In addition to law enforcement, this has begun to be used by some adult protective services, some agencies across the country. There's no reason why it should be limited to law enforcement, so we're thrilled that the tool is being used more broadly. But again, it's another example of our trying to meet a demand that we've heard about from many of our law enforcement partners. Roll call videos, as many of the panelists mentioned, this is where a lot of the most important information is conveyed to local law enforcement. And so we, again, working with IACP, developed this series of roll call videos. These are really, really well done. And they highlight many different types of abuse. And so it's, again, on our website and accessible to everyone. And to the extent that anyone ever else wants to download these and use them as part of your roll call to educate local law enforcement about these issues, it's certainly available to all of you. again, working with and being an effective interviewer or working with older adults with Alzheimer's or dementia is important. And so our website also includes links to different types of training that others have put together in terms of working with and interfacing with persons with dementia or Alzheimer's. Just a couple of other ones. I have a lot of stuff to go through, but I want to make sure we can ask our panelists a few more questions. The couple of things I want to highlight, one is the National Elder and Dependent Adult Abuse Community. There are many, many people across the country working on these types of cases, and it's our belief that we should be able to tap into that deep reservoir of experience through panels and webinars like this one, but also we want to provide an avenue where people can just talk to one another and ask each other, have you investigated one of these cases? How did you do it? Like, how did you overcome that barrier? And so the elder abuse community here, which is hosted by the California District Attorneys Association, provides that space. It provides a way, it's a secure website, and it is available to prosecutors and law enforcement only to provide a safe space where they can ask each other questions about elder abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation, and compare notes and compare best practices in order to tap into that reservoir of experience. Also, I want to highlight, obviously, a big focus of today's discussion has been on multidisciplinary teams. Well, there are many, many, many different types of teams out there focusing on elder justice issues. You know, they range from the multidisciplinary teams, which tend to focus on physical abuse, but there are FAST teams out there, you know, financial abuse teams. There are wings, which focus on guardianship-related issues. And so what we tried to do at the Elder Justice Initiative was create this one place where you can search on a state-by-state basis for where all these different types of elder justice teams are. So you can not only see who may be working on these issues in your backyard or who you may be able to start collaborating with for purposes of developing your own multidisciplinary team, but also to show you sort of who else is out there in different states, to the extent that you want to go to your neighboring state, which has a robust MDT program, and ask them how did they do it? What are the challenges that they confronted? How are they able to put together a team? This map allows for that and allows for us to, again, tap into that reservoir, tap into and show how many people out there are working on these issues and why they're not alone. Lastly, I just want to highlight very, very quickly, the department, beyond sort of COPS and the Elder Justice Initiative, there are many, many different components within the department working on elder abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation. And they include the Office of Victims of Violence Against Women. They have been doing really tremendous in-person training throughout the country for over a decade. And for FY 2020, awarded numerous grants, which means that they will be going out to 8 different communities to provide training on the ground for prosecutors, law enforcement, judges, APS, and other community members who are focusing on elder abuse-related issues. Office of Victims of Crime, also a leader in the department on its efforts in combating elder abuse. And so they have done given out a number of awards, including training for law enforcement, improved identification and response to elder fraud victims, as well as other programs to improve victim services for older adults. So they are out there doing tremendous work as well. In addition, one of their big achievements the past couple of years has been the funding and support for the National Elder Fraud Hotline, a single number where people can call and report elder fraud, and it will direct them to other resources that may be available to them. Also, and lastly, I would just highlight NIJ, the National Institute for Justice. Ironically, the Department of Justice is one of the foremost funders of research on elder abuse and neglect and financial exploitation. It is not intuitive, but we are. And a lot of the work that NIJ has funded has led to seminal studies which are translated into forensics and how law enforcement investigates elder abuse, ranging from dealing with pressure sores or pressure ulcers and bruising. And these are important because the science will help impact how we investigate these cases. So NIJ is out there doing tremendous work on that front as well. So notwithstanding promising not to, I appear to have run the clock. I think we have answered most of the questions that came on. So with that, I would just thank all the panelists for your terrific work and for taking the time out of your busy schedules to share your wisdom and experience with us. And thank the audience for coming and participating on this as well and trying to take advantage of this information. Liza, anything else that you want to add?
No, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.